Matthew Offord.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for calling me to speak after that passionate speech. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak in this debate today, as I have more Jewish constituents than anyone else in the chamber today, apart from, of course, my honourable friend, the member for Finchley and Golders Green. But unfortunately, he's not able to speak as he's a whip. So I'm sure he'd be thrilled that I speak, no doubt, upon his behalf as well. But as a Member of Parliament for any faith group, if I either promote or defend a cause or an issue, many critics will say, well, you will say that, won't you? Because your constituents would expect you to do so. And for many of my constituents, and by default myself as well, the Holocaust is something that is very personal to us. And I have constituents who are in places like Bergen-Belsen, one who I've previously spoken about in this chamber, and indeed who I'm very fond of and visit regularly. And I should take this opportunity to wish Mazel Tov to Manfred Goldberg and Kurt Marx, who both received the British Empire Medal for services to Holocaust education in the New Year's Honours List, and we're very proud of them. And just like the member for West Ham, I take the opportunity at this time of year to do two things. The first one is that I always like to read a memoir or factual account of the Holocaust, and I'm pleased to be reading If This Is a Man by Primo Levi right now. And the second thing I like to do, again like the member for West Ham, is to consider Holocaust Memorial Day from a different perspective. And indeed, for the last few months, I've been thinking about concentration camps on British soil. And any member who's read Nicholas Welshman's brilliant book, KL, will know how the concentration camps came about. The KL refers to the German word Konzentrationslager. And in Germany in 1933, many of the first people arrested by the Nazis were detained in a variety of locations, including police stations, stables, schools, and even industrial buildings. Certainly none of the locations that we have in our public consciousness. And these people were held in protective custody for their own safety. And most of those were actually released at a later stage. And during that time, the law was used to defend many of them. Their relatives went to the courts to say that their treatment was not as it should be, and under the law they did have some protections. But of course that didn't last, and we know that as the Second World War continued, the rules certainly changed. But the Konzentrationslager of Dachau in 1933 was very different from the Konzentrationslager of Auschwitz in 1944. Initially, Dachau targeted political opponents of the Nazis, such as German communists, socialists, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and persons accused of asocial or socially deviant behaviour by the Nazis. By contrast, Auschwitz was a sprawling death camp containing European Jewry, gypsies, and others. As Primo Levi wrote, trains heavily laden with human beings went in each day, and all that came out was the ashes of their bodies, their hair, and the gold of their teeth. So representation of these camps in films and popular culture depicts Auschwitz-Birkenau at the pinnacle of the death camps. And it was only Treblinka that was actually closely aligned to it, including the number of people who were murdered, alongside the other camps such as Belzec, Kelno, and Sobibor. And all these camps were devoted to killing. They were death camps. Anyone who went through their gates would not come out again. But in 1967, the West German government the West German Ministry of Justice drew up a list of 1,200 camps that it said were sub-camps of these main ones. And indeed, the Jewish Virtual Library has come up with an even greater figure of 15,000 camps, which it said were effectively Konzentrationslager. And so the representation of these camps through their names, to many of us, gives them a distant location and an otherness that is not only foreign, but is certainly not something that's part of the British collective consciousness. But that is not the case. So last summer, I was fortunate enough to sail to the Channel Islands, and I visited Alderney. This was the only part of the British Isles inhabited by the Nazis during the Second World War. In January 1942, the Nazis built 4 camps in Alderney, 2 work camps, Lager Hiegerland and Lager Borkum, and 2 concentration camps, Lager Sylt and Lager Norderney. Lager Norderney contained Russian and Polish prisoners of war, and the Lager Sylt camp held Jewish slave labourers. Now, there are 397 graves in Alderney, and that's out of a total of a population of about 6,000 people. But on their return to the islanders, to the island of Alderney, the islanders had little or no knowledge of the crimes that had taken place, because when they were finally allowed to return in December 1945, the majority of the superior or senior German officers had left, and no one really knew what had happened. And interestingly, the research has been conducted by Professor Caroline Sturdy-Coles at Staffordshire University. She's described the number of victims as very conservative, given the difficulty of identifying prisoners in war records. Now, the whole issue of post-Holocaust archaeology is a very contested area, and indeed very painful for many people who had direct experience of the Holocaust. She has said that her research on the island has come up against great hostility, including from the Alderney government itself, which she said had refused a permit for her to evacuate some of the sites, forcing the research that she undertook to rely on non-invasive methods of analysis, such as drone filming. Now, I have to tread carefully as I say this, but there is also some reluctance on behalf of the Jewish community in the United Kingdom to give permission for the excavation work of Jewish burial sites. This is a very, very delicate area, and I know that the great Chief Rabbi, who is my constituent, Ephraim Mervis, has been involved in this issue. Rabbinical law dictates that the grave sites of Jewish people should not be disturbed, and I have a great deal of sympathy with that point of view. However, I do have a belief that unmarked graves, mass graves, and locations of bodies hidden by the murderers are not proper graves within themselves. And I believe that it is appropriate for the identification of bodies to be undertaken, because people do need a proper resting place. And the places and locations I've described, do not believe are proper graves. And as Elie Wiesel wrote, to forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. So I certainly will continue the conversations that I have had with others about this delicate and sensitive process of identifying locations of bodies, and also those persons who are in those graves. So for me, Holocaust Memorial Day isn't just something that's evoked through films like Schindler's List. It is something that's very personal and pertinent to many of my constituents. And I think that I'd certainly going to conclude upon the words of Primo Levi in his fantastic book, when he says, "It happens, therefore it can happen again." And this is the core of what we have to say. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.